Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're shining up some armor, grabbing a sword that's way too heavy, and riding straight into one of history's most overhyped jobs, being a medieval knight. You know, the kind of guy everyone pictures when they think of honor, chivalry, and saving maidens from dragons. Yeah, about that. Turns out, most knights spent more time dealing with mud, debt, and body odor than actually slaying monsters or attending fancy banquets. So, get cozy, lie back, and let's slowly peel back the shiny metal fantasy to see what life as a knight was really like. If you've ever looked at medieval paintings and thought, wow, those guys had it all, just remember that artist was probably paid by a noble family who didn't want you to see the sweat stains. Being a knight was basically the Middle Ages version of looking cool on Instagram, all about the armor, the glory, and the clout. But behind the scenes, miserable, exhausting, sometimes even deadly, and not in the fun, heroic way, but more like, oops, I suffocated inside my own helmet kind of deadly. Now, let's start where most knightly stories begin, the myth. The shining hero galloping through green fields, banners flapping, a noble heart beating under layers of polished steel. Reality check. Most knights smelled like horse manure, had fleas, and couldn't move their necks properly. The armor was heavy. We're talking 50 to 70 pounds of metal. And if you fell over, you'd need at least 2 people to help you stand back up. Romantic, right? You'd think being a knight was a life of endless adventure. But truthfully, most of it was waiting around. Waiting for wars, waiting for your lord to call you, waiting for the mud to dry, or just waiting for someone to help you out of your armor so you could finally scratch your nose. But before we get to all that, let's rewind to how one even became a knight, because spoiler alert, it wasn't easy. And it definitely wasn't glamorous. To start, you didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what, I think I'll be a knight. Nope, you had to be born into it, part of the lower nobility, or a family rich enough to afford the whole knight package. Armor, horses, weapons, training, all that cost a fortune. So basically, your fate was sealed the moment you popped out of the womb. If your parents were peasants, you'd be lucky to see a knight, let alone become one. If you were born into the right family, your childhood was still not much fun. Around age 7, you'd be sent away to live with another noble household to start training as a page. That meant being the medieval version of an unpaid intern, cleaning weapons, serving meals, and learning how to behave like a noble. You'd learn manners, horse riding, and how to use a sword without immediately slicing your own leg open. Sounds noble, but really, it was endless chores and constant yelling from older knights. By your teenage years, if you survived long enough and didn't accidentally stab your instructor, you'd level up to squire. That meant even more work, polishing armor, taking care of your knight's horse, carrying his weapons, and sometimes literally standing next to him on the battlefield, praying he didn't die so you wouldn't have to fight in his place. You'd also get trained in fighting, sure, but most of it was painful and repetitive. And remember, this was before helmets had much ventilation. So half your training time was probably spent trying not to pass out. After years of this exhausting apprenticeship, you'd finally get knighted, maybe after proving yourself in a battle, or just because your lord felt generous that day. There'd be a fancy ceremony, with prayers and vows of chivalry, and maybe even a feast afterward. Everyone clapped, you looked great, and for one night, you might actually feel like a hero. Then, the next morning, you'd realize you were now financially responsible for maintaining all your expensive knightly gear. Congratulations, you just unlocked medieval debt. Armor was ridiculously costly, like the equivalent of buying a luxury car today, and horses. Oh, don't even get me started. A good warhorse could cost as much as a small castle. Plus, you had to feed it, groom it, and keep it alive during wars. Losing a horse in battle was like totaling your Ferrari, only worse, because it also probably meant you were about to die too. So knights often went broke trying to look the part. Being a knight wasn't about bravery or honor, it was about managing your medieval credit score. And then there was chivalry, that shiny code of conduct that supposedly made knights noble and kind and respectful toward women. Yeah, let's just say that was more of a marketing slogan than a real rule book. Sure, they talked a big game about protecting the weak and being honorable. But in reality, many knights were bullies, raiders, and opportunists. They fought for whoever paid them more, and honor was flexible. like, "I'll be honorable after I loot this village," kind of flexible. But that myth of chivalry stuck around because it sounded good. The church liked it. It made war seem holy. The poets loved it. It made for great love stories. And the nobles really loved it. It made them look civilized while they were, stabbing people for land. Meanwhile, the average knight was just trying to survive in a world where everything could kill you. Battles, disease, armor malfunctions, or the occasional bad stew at the Lord's banquet. Speaking of armor, let's talk about how awful it actually was. Movies always make it look easy. Knights running around, swinging swords, flipping over horses. In real life, that armor turned you into a slow, sweaty tin can. Once it was on, you were basically sealed inside. The padding underneath, called a gambeson, was thick, itchy, and soaked with sweat by noon. In summer, you'd overheat. In winter, it froze stiff. And remember, there were no zippers or easy clasps. It took about 15 minutes and a couple of servants to get in or out of your armor. Forget bathroom breaks, you held it until the fight was over, or well, sometimes you didn't. Even your weapon wasn't always reliable. Swords could break, helmets blocked your vision, and chainmail snagged on everything. You'd think knights were unstoppable tanks, but a peasant with a long spear could easily unhorse one. If you fell into the mud in full armor, you were basically done for. There are even records of knights drowning in shallow puddles because they couldn't stand up in time. Imagine going down in history as Sir Reginald, defeated by a mud patch. Legendary. And that's before we even talk about the battles themselves. They weren't the clean one-on-one duels you see in stories. They were chaotic, messy, and horrifying. The noise alone would be unbearable. Metal clashing, horses screaming, men shouting. Visibility, almost none. You'd be swinging blindly, hoping to hit an enemy and not your friend. Add in exhaustion, dehydration, and fear, and you start realizing that most knights probably wanted to be anywhere else. But even when they weren't fighting, life wasn't peaceful. A knight's duties could include guarding castles, collecting taxes, or enforcing their lord's orders, not always pleasant work. You might spend months living in damp stone rooms, eating stale bread, surrounded by rats, and all for the glory of serving a noble who probably couldn't even remember your name. Still, the legend of the knight survived. The stories, the poems, the shining image of the brave warrior. Maybe it's because people needed heroes, even if those heroes were mostly fictional. The truth was too bleak, a life of discomfort, danger, and debt wrapped in a pretty myth. And as you picture that knight tonight, sitting by a campfire after a long, muddy day, peeling off his armor and groaning from bruises, remember that he probably dreamed of a quiet, simple life. Maybe one where no one expected him to charge into battle for a cause he didn't understand. Maybe one where he could just sit, drink ale, and not smell like horse sweat. So, as we drift deeper into this story, let us leave behind the fairy tales and get closer to the real world of the medieval knight. A world that was more exhausting than exciting, more grimy than glorious. Because tonight, we're not chasing dragons or winning honor. We're just lying here, listening to the clank of armor, the snort of horses, and the soft sigh of history reminding us, sometimes, the most romantic stories are also the most miserable. Sometimes, the most romantic stories are also the most miserable. And that misery, for a knight, often started way before they ever got to wear armor or ride into battle. It began in childhood, long before the Sir title, before the glory, before the chainmail started chafing. Because becoming a knight wasn't just a job, it was a lifelong boot camp that started the moment you were old enough to walk without falling on your face. If you were lucky enough to be born into a noble family, your parents didn't celebrate your birth with toys or lullabies. Nope, they looked at you and thought, perfect. Another potential soldier for the family name. And as soon as you were about 7 years old, you'd be packed off to another noble's castle to begin your training. Imagine being a small child, leaving home, knowing you wouldn't see your family for years, all to serve strangers who'd yell at you for dropping a spoon. Welcome to page life. As a page, you were basically the medieval equivalent of a house servant with homework. You'd wake up before sunrise, polish armor until your arms hurt, feed horses, run errands, and maybe, get a few minutes to practice swordplay with wooden sticks. But most of your training wasn't even about fighting yet. It was about learning how to be a proper nobleman, table manners, dancing, serving meals, reciting prayers, and not spilling soup on your lord's cloak. Pages were supposed to learn courtesy and humility, which in medieval language meant doing everything you were told and never complaining. Even if your hands were covered in blisters, your bed was probably a straw mat on the floor. Your meals were whatever scraps were left after the nobles ate. And if you made a mistake, there was no time out, just harsh words or a quick cuff on the ear to remind you that pages didn't have opinions. But you endured, because you had a dream one day. You'd be a knight, wearing shiny armor and riding a horse like a hero. Except, you'd soon realize that dream required surviving another stage, being a squire. Becoming a squire was a promotion, sure, but also a massive upgrade in responsibility. Around age 14, you'd get assigned to an actual knight, and from that point on, you were his shadow. You woke him up, helped him dress, polished his weapons, saddled his weapons, fetched his meals, and followed him everywhere like a loyal puppy with a toolkit. In return, he'd teach you how to fight, or at least yell at you until you learned not to drop your sword. Training was rough. There were no gyms, no safety gear, no warm-up stretches. You learned by doing, which meant bruises, broken fingers, and sometimes worse. You'd practice sword fighting, spear throwing, wrestling, and riding until your muscles screamed for mercy. And even when you weren't training, you were expected to be on call. If your knight decided to ride out at dawn, you were up before him, strapping armor, adjusting straps, praying nothing snapped mid-battle. And speaking of armor, as a squire, you were responsible for keeping it spotless. Which sounds easy, until you realize medieval armor was covered in tiny metal parts that rusted if you so much as sneezed on them. You'd spend hours scrubbing, polishing, and oiling every piece until you could see your exhausted face reflected in it. And if it wasn't perfect, you'd hear about it, loudly, but it wasn't all punishment. Sometimes, if your knight was kind, you'd get to ride alongside him during hunts or tournaments. That was the dream, feeling the wind on your face, the crowd cheering, the thrill of being part of something heroic. Though usually, you were just there to hold his spare lance or clean up after the horse. Still, every glimpse of glory kept you going. And then came the day every squire hoped for, the dubbing ceremony, the moment you'd finally be declared a knight. If your lord thought you'd earned it, you'd spend the night before in a chapel, praying, reflecting, and probably trying not to fall asleep on the cold stone floor. At dawn, you'd be presented in front of the nobles. You'd kneel, take an oath to protect the weak, serve the church, and uphold the laws of chivalry. Then, your lord would tap you on the shoulders with a sword, say some solemn words, and just like that, you were officially a knight. Everyone clapped, the trumpets sounded, and you probably felt like the hero you always imagined. But reality came crashing in fast. Because now, you weren't just a servant, you were a warrior. And warriors had expenses. See, being a knight didn't come with a salary. You didn't get paid a nice monthly wage or free meals. What you got was a title and a mountain of financial responsibility. Armor, for example, could cost as much as a modern sports car. And it wasn't one-time spending. Armor needed constant repairs and replacements. Horses were expensive too, and you couldn't have just one. You needed at least two, a warhorse for battle and a regular one for travel. Both needed feed, grooming, and care. Then there were weapons, swords, lances, daggers, all custom-made and costly. If you were lucky, your lord might give you some land to manage, or let you keep part of the loot from battles. But for many knights, the math didn't add up. You'd end up in debt just trying to look the part. Some knights even sold off their armor or pawned their horses when times got tough. So much for chivalric glory. Half the time, you were just trying not to go bankrupt. And when you did finally get called to war, it wasn't like the movies. You didn't charge gallantly across open fields to save the kingdom. You followed your lord's orders, even if that meant marching for weeks, sleeping in muddy camps, and eating hard bread so stale it could double as a weapon. When you finally reached the battlefield, you'd line up, try not to panic, and hope your armor didn't jam your joints when the fight started. Most medieval battles weren't glorious duels, they were chaos. Clouds of dust, the sound of horns, the clatter of armor, the screaming of men and horses. You couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and once the fighting started, it was pure survival. Knights were supposed to be elite fighters, but they were also prime targets. Everyone wanted to take down a knight, not just for the honor, but because your armor was worth a fortune. If you fell, there was a good chance someone would strip you before you even hit the ground. And if you survived, well, congratulations, you might get captured. Yes, even that was common. Knights were often taken prisoner and ransomed back to their families for gold. It was almost like a side business. You'd go to war, get captured, your family paid, you came home broke, and then did it all again next year. Still, for all the exhaustion, debt, and danger, the idea of being a knight had power. It made you part of an exclusive club, a symbol of order in a chaotic world. People looked up to you, sang songs about you, painted murals of your supposed bravery. Never mind that half those songs were wildly exaggerated. It didn't matter. The image was everything, and that's how the myth kept going. Each generation of boys grew up dreaming of shining armor and noble quests, while the real knights were out there sweating, starving, and worrying about their next repair bill. It's kind of funny, we think of knights as the heroes of their time, but really, they were just guys trying to get by in a rough system that expected them to fight, spend, and smile through it all. So yeah, being a knight sounded great in theory, but behind that glorious image was a lifetime of hard labor, impossible expectations, and constant financial ruin. Not exactly bedtime story material, though maybe that's what makes it perfect, because even knights, those legendary figures of strength and honor, were just human, tired, broke, and dreaming of peace. And as the night deepens, imagine one of them now, sitting by a campfire after a long, muddy battle. His armor dented, his sword dull, his hands trembling as he tries to eat a cold piece of bread. Around him, the world is silent except for the crackle of fire and the snort of horses. In that quiet moment, he's not a hero. He's just a man who wants to go home. He's not a hero. He's just a man who wants to go home. And that home, by the way, wasn't always the cozy stone castle you're picturing. Sure, some knights had castles, big, echoing ones that looked impressive from the outside, but on the inside, think more drafty, damp, and dark than warm and noble. Castles weren't designed for comfort. They were military fortresses, meant to keep people out, not keep residents happy. Imagine trying to sleep while the wind howled through cracks in the walls, and the room smelled faintly of smoke, mold, and wet dog. Most rooms had no real glass windows, just narrow slits to shoot arrows through or let a bit of air in. And because everyone cooked, slept, and lived near open fires, the air was always thick with smoke. Candles and torches gave off light, but also a constant layer of soot that clung to everything. You'd wake up with a sore throat, sore back, and possibly a few new insect bites from the straw mattress that hadn't been changed in ever. During peacetime, knights didn't just sit around polishing swords and admiring their reflections. They had jobs to do, usually for their lord or the king. That could mean patrolling borders, overseeing peasants, or collecting taxes, which was basically going door to door in full armor to remind people to pay up. Not exactly glamorous. Some knights managed estates, keeping track of crops, livestock, and rents. It was work that required patience and paperwork, two things not often associated with sword-swinging warriors. Others served as guards in castles or towns, standing for hours at a time, wearing heavy armor, watching peasants go about their day. Sometimes you'd be stationed at a gate, greeting travelers, or worse, searching wagons for contraband. And the pay for all this? Barely enough to maintain your gear. Many knights depended on favors and gifts from their lords just to stay afloat. If you weren't working for someone, you might end up as a free knight, or as they called it, a knight errant, the wandering type, always on the move looking for employment or tournaments. Sounds adventurous, but in reality, it was like being a freelancer with expensive habits. You'd travel from town to town, hoping a noble would hire you for protection, or that you could win a little money in a tournament. But travel was slow, dangerous, and expensive. And tournaments, oh, they were brutal. Everyone thinks tournaments were fun, a kind of medieval sports event with cheering crowds and noble entertainment. But for knights, they were risky business. The rules varied, but most involved being bashed off your horse by someone aiming a heavy lance at your chest. The wooden lances were supposed to break on impact, supposed to being the key phrase there. Many knights walked away with broken ribs, concussions, or not at all. And even if you won, the prize money often went straight to repairing your armor or buying a new horse. It was like entering a boxing match where you pay for your own bandages afterward. When there weren't wars or tournaments, knights often got bored, really bored. The romantic idea of the noble warrior turned into long stretches of sitting around, eating too much bread, and drinking too much ale. Feasts were one of the few entertainments they had, Massive meals where everyone stuffed themselves with meat, drank from shared cups, and listened to minstrels sing songs about other knights who probably had worse lives than theirs. But even feasts weren't as glamorous as the stories suggest. The food was often overcooked or spoiled, and hygiene was medieval. There were no forks, just knives and fingers, and no one washed their hands before eating. Dogs wandered around the hall, picking up scraps, while servants refilled cups with whatever wine hadn't gone sour yet. The rich ate at the high table under tapestries. The lesser knights and guests sat below, hoping the ceiling didn't drip on them. And because there was no plumbing, people often just emptied chamber pots out the nearest window. So if you were walking near the castle wall, surprise. Still, knights were expected to act refined in public, at least by the standards of the time. That meant speaking politely, pretending to follow the code of chivalry, and not starting drunken brawls during dinner, though that last one was often ignored. The church liked to remind knights that they were defenders of the faith, protectors of the weak, and examples of virtue. But on a typical night, you'd find them gossiping, flirting with servants, or bragging about battles they barely survived. And then there were the constant minor wars, small raids, skirmishes, or disputes between neighboring lords. Knights were the go-to guys for these. One week you might be helping defend a border village. The next, you're raiding someone else's grain supply. Warfare was almost a business. You fought for whoever could pay or promised you land. Loyalty was flexible. After all, everyone needed to eat. In between these fights, you maintained your weapons and armor, which was practically a full-time job. Swords needed sharpening, chainmail needed mending, and horses needed daily care. You'd spend hours brushing your horse, checking its hooves, feeding it, talking to it, probably your only real friend after months on the road. Horses were everything to a knight. They were transportation, status, and survival rolled into one. Losing your horse could mean losing your career. But even if you did everything right, life had a way of being unpredictable. A sudden illness, a bad harvest, or a shift in politics could ruin you. Knights depended on the favor of their lords, and that could vanish overnight. One wrong move, one insult at a feast, or backing the wrong side in a local feud, and suddenly you were out of work, out of land, and out of luck. That's when some knights turned to less noble work. There were plenty of robber knights, desperate men who used their training and armor to raid villages and rob travelers. Think of them as medieval mercenaries who'd stopped pretending to be heroes. The church condemned them, kings tried to control them, but when the economy was bad, these rogue knights were everywhere, and honestly, who could blame them? You spend your whole life being told you're part of a noble class, destined for honor and fame. But most days you're just hungry, sore, and broke. The stories said knights fought for love and faith. The truth was, they fought for survival. Still, despite everything, the mud, the debt, the danger, knights clung to their identity. They needed it. The title Sir meant something, even if it came with bruises and bills. It separated them from the peasants and the merchants, gave them a purpose in a chaotic world. You might be miserable, but at least you weren't ordinary. And maybe, deep down, that's what kept them going. The belief that they were part of something bigger, that all the exhaustion and pain meant something. They'd ride out in the morning mist, armor creaking, banner fluttering, pretending they were heroes in a song, even if they knew the songs lied. When night fell again, they'd return to their cold castle, dismount, and peel off layers of metal until they could finally breathe. The fire would crackle, the hall would fill with low laughter and the smell of roasted meat. Maybe someone would sing about a great knight who once saved a kingdom. Maybe, for a few quiet minutes, they'd let themselves believe the story was about them. But as the candles burned low and the hall emptied, they'd sit there, staring into the embers, wondering how long the peace would last. Because in the medieval world, it never did, and when peace broke, knights had something else to lean on. Not money, not rest, not even reason, but the code. The sacred, shining, poetic code of chivalry. You've probably heard of it. Courage, loyalty, honesty, respect for women, mercy toward the weak. Sounds lovely, right? Like something a hero would live by. But here's the fun part. The code of chivalry was kind of like those inspirational quotes people post online. Everyone shared them. Nobody actually followed them. The truth is, chivalry was less a rulebook and more of a PR stunt. It was created to make violent men sound respectable. Imagine you've got an army full of knights, trained killers with tempers and swords. and you need to convince the public they're doing all this for noble reasons. So you wrap their lifestyle in poetry and call it a moral code. It worked beautifully. Knights became symbols of honor instead of chaos. People sang about them instead of fearing them. And the knights, they got to feel a little better about all the pillaging. The church loved it, of course. It turned war into something holy. Instead of saying, "We're conquering land for power," they could say, "We're defending the faith." Same sword, fancier reason. And soon, poems and romances began painting knights as these flawless men of virtue who would never lie, steal, or even think of harming the innocent. Never mind that. In reality, many knights did all three before breakfast. But let's be fair, some knights did try to live by it. There were a few who genuinely believed in being honorable and protecting the weak. They prayed before battles, showed mercy to enemies, and tried not to be complete nightmares to their servants. Yet the system they lived in made that nearly impossible. Because when your income depends on warfare, mercy doesn't always pay the bills. Picture it. You've got a code telling you to respect your enemies and protect the innocent. But your lord just ordered you to burn down a rival's village because they didn't pay taxes. Do you refuse and lose your livelihood, or do you do it and tell yourself it's for the greater good? Most knights picked the second option, then said an extra prayer later to balance the scales. And that's what made chivalry such a complicated thing. It wasn't hypocrisy so much as survival, dressed up in fancy words. Knights weren't saints. They were products of a brutal world that expected them to be gentle and ruthless at the same time. Let's take the classic respect for women rule, for instance. In poetry, knights were supposed to dedicate their deeds to noble ladies, protect their virtue, and pine romantically from afar. In reality, the ladies in those songs were often married women from rich families, and the whole system was less about love and more about showing off. A knight would wear a lady's scarf or ribbon into battle, not because he was deeply in love, but because it looked good. It said, "I have a noblewoman who likes me enough to lend me her laundry." And let's not even get started on how respecting women often meant ignoring everyone who wasn't noble. Peasant women, commoners, they didn't count. Chivalry was written for and about the upper class, and conveniently skipped everyone else. So when the songs said knights were defenders of women, they really meant defenders of women who could afford nice jewelry. Then there's the rule about being merciful to enemies. Again, sounds beautiful in theory. But knights fought in a world where mercy was a luxury. On the battlefield, hesitation could get you killed. And while it was noble to ransom a captured knight for money instead of killing him, that rule didn't apply to the regular soldiers. Commoners were expendable. The mercy code was basically, be kind to people who can pay you back later. Even tournaments, which were supposed to be friendly competitions showing off knightly skill, often turned into chaotic brawls. Technically, they had rules: don't kill, don't maim, don't stab someone's horse. But when the adrenaline hit, those rules went out the window. Knights would go home battered, bleeding, sometimes missing teeth, all while insisting it was done in the spirit of honor. And let's not forget the honesty part. Chivalry said a knight should always tell the truth, keep his word, and never betray trust. But in medieval politics, lying was practically a survival skill. Lords and kings broke oaths all the time, switching sides in wars whenever it suited them. A knight's loyalty usually followed his paycheck. If your lord lost power, you didn't stay loyal out of love. You quietly pledged to whoever replaced him. It wasn't betrayal, it was strategy. But for all its contradictions, the code of chivalry had a strange power. It gave knights a story to live by, something to believe in. Even if they didn't always follow it, they wanted to believe they could. It made their dangerous, uncertain lives feel meaningful. You weren't just fighting to survive, you were fighting for ideals, honor, justice, loyalty. It gave structure to the chaos, and there were moments, rare ones, when knights lived up to those ideals. When they showed mercy to prisoners, defended villages, or stood by their word even when it cost them everything. Those moments are the ones history remembers. The trouble is, they were exceptions, not the rule. But exceptions make better bedtime stories. So poets like Chrétien de Troyes, and later, writers like Thomas Malory, turned these flawed, exhausted warriors into legends. They wrote tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, noblemen, bound by pure ideals. The real knights probably read those stories and laughed. Or maybe they didn't laugh, maybe they wished it were true. Maybe, after years of blood and mud, they liked imagining a world where knights really were good, and battles were fought for love, instead of politics. In a way, that myth of chivalry kept medieval society running. It gave people something to look up to, even if it wasn't real. It convinced the peasants that the nobles weren't just violent landlords, but guardians of morality. It made the church look holy for supporting wars. It was the Middle Ages' greatest PR campaign, and it worked for centuries. But behind every song of noble knights was another story, one the bards didn't sing about. The knight who returned from war broken, haunted by what he'd done. The one who couldn't afford to feed his family after years of service. The one who followed every rule and still lost everything. That's the part of the chivalric code they didn't write down. The quiet cost of trying to live up to impossible ideals. The exhaustion of pretending to be perfect in a world that rewarded cruelty. So yes, chivalry sounded noble. It dressed up war in romance, made violence poetic. But if you'd lived then, surrounded by smoke, fear, and endless marching, you might have laughed too. The only code most knights truly followed was, stay alive, pay your debts, and hope your armor doesn't rust before the next fight. And yet, as cynical as it all was, you can't help but admire it a little. Humans have always needed myths, stories that make us feel like we're more than just animals fighting over scraps. Chivalry was that myth for the Middle Ages. It made sense of the chaos. It gave knights something to whisper to themselves in the dark when the guilt came creeping in. I'm not just a killer, they'd think. I'm a defender of faith, a protector, a knight. Maybe that lie or that hope was the only thing that kept them going. And as the fire burns low in the great hall, and the banners sway gently above, a knight might close his eyes and dream of a world where the songs were true, where honor mattered more than power, and good men could win without spilling blood. But when morning came, the armor waited, the sword hung ready by the bed, and outside, the world still ran on violence, politics, and gold. The code was beautiful, but the job still sucked. And if the job still sucked, battle days were when it sucked the most. Forget all those slow-motion movie scenes where knights ride across sunny meadows with banners fluttering and epic music playing. Real medieval battles looked, smelled, and felt a lot more like absolute chaos, and not the fun kind. The kind where everyone's yelling, your vision's half blocked by your helmet, and you're not even sure who you're supposed to be stabbing anymore. Imagine waking up at dawn, stomach growling because you've had nothing but bread and watered-down ale for 2 days. You strap on your armor, which feels like putting on a metal coffin, and you mount your horse, who, by the way, probably hates you right now. The poor animal's wearing armor too, and it knows something bad's coming. You line up with a few hundred other knights, all sweating, all trying to look confident, while secretly thinking, please don't let me die in the mud today. The battlefield doesn't look romantic either. It's churned up dirt, animal waste, smoke from torches, and the smell of fear. There's no cinematic galloping. Horses trip, people fall, and when the charge begins, it's not graceful, it's terrifying. Dozens of men thundering forward in heavy armor, lances aimed, dust everywhere, screaming so loud you can't even hear your own heartbeat. Now, the movies make it look like knights just crash into each other. One clean hit, and the good guy wins. Reality was much more confusing and messier. Most of the time, lances shattered, horses stumbled, and knights got thrown to the ground like sacks of potatoes. Once you hit the dirt, it was a nightmare. Your armor made it almost impossible to get up quickly, and there's a good chance some enemy foot soldier is running toward you with a hammer, ready to test just how impenetrable your shiny plate really is. You might think being covered in armor made you invincible. Nope, armor protected you, sure, but it also turned every fight into a slow, exhausting wrestling match. Swinging a sword while wearing 30 kilos of steel. It's like fighting underwater. Every movement burns your muscles. You can't see properly through the visor. You can't breathe well. And if you trip or fall wrong, you might just end up suffocating in your own armor before anyone even bothers to stab you. And then there's the noise. People forget about the sound of battle, the clanging metal, the screams of men and horses, the thud of weapons hitting shields and bone. It's overwhelming. You couldn't hear commands, you couldn't hear prayers, just chaos. One knight later described a battle as the sound of hell itself. Another said it was like being lost in thunder, and even when you won, it didn't feel glorious. Victory wasn't a shining moment with trumpets and cheers. It was realizing you were still alive when others weren't. You'd look around at the field. Bodies, blood, broken weapons, and think, well, that's over, I guess. And it didn't end when the fighting stopped. After battles, knights had to walk among the corpses looking for ransom-worthy captives. That was the real payday. Killing a fellow knight was stupid. Capturing him meant money. You'd drag him off, patch him up just enough to keep him alive, and then demand gold for his return. It was a weirdly polite business arrangement, in between all the horror. Of course, that courtesy didn't extend to common soldiers. They were killed or left to rot. Nobody ransomed peasants. They weren't worth anything. And while we're here, let's talk about wounds. Medieval medicine wasn't exactly advanced. If you got stabbed, burned, or crushed in battle, congratulations, you'd just unlocked the horrific infection achievement. Doctors, or surgeons, as they called them, didn't know about germs. Their treatment options were mostly cauterize it with hot iron, cut off the limb, or smear it with something that sounded fancy but was basically mud and wine. Surviving a battle often just meant dying more slowly later. Some knights didn't even make it back to camp before the infection started. Imagine wearing armor for hours in the heat, sweating into padded cloth that you can't wash properly, and then having an open wound underneath. Bacteria paradise. And no one wanted to take their armor off right after a fight. Too risky. So you'd sit there, filthy, sore, hungry, and quietly rotting a little bit inside. Even if you came out completely uninjured, rare, the exhaustion was brutal. Marching all day, swinging weapons, carrying gear, shouting through metal. The body took a beating even without a sword wound, and there wasn't exactly a medieval version of trauma counseling waiting for you afterward. You just went home, prayed, and hoped the nightmares would stop eventually. And oh, the nightmares. Knights didn't talk about it much, but we know from later writings that many suffered from what we'd now call PTSD, night terrors. Sudden fits of rage, guilt, hallucinations. They didn't have names for these things back then, but they knew something was wrong. Chronic violence rewired people. It turned them cold or broken or both. And because emotion was seen as weakness, they had to carry it all silently. But the weirdest part, for all this horror, many knights liked fighting, not because they were cruel, well, some were, but because war was the only time their skills meant anything. In peace, a knight was just an expensive bored nobleman. In war, he had purpose, adrenaline, glory, or at least the illusion of it. It was what they'd been trained for since childhood. Without battle, their identity kind of fell apart. And speaking of training, that's what made them so dangerously efficient. From the age of 7, noble boys were groomed for this life. Pages, then squires, then finally knights. They learned how to handle weapons, ride horses, fight dirty, and obey orders without question. But what they didn't learn was how to stop fighting. There was no after, no retirement plan, no peaceful life waiting at the end. Just endless service, as long as you could lift a sword. Even tournaments, those fun mock battles meant for sport, could be fatal. One wrong move, one misplaced blow, and you were done. There were famous cases of knights being killed by splintered lances or crushed under horses in these so-called games, but the audience loved it. The risk was part of the entertainment. Think medieval NASCAR. Everyone said they came for the skill, but secretly they were watching for the crashes. And if you think all this was worth it because knights were honored or respected, well, sure, sometimes. But most of the time, they were just tools in someone else's game. Kings and lords used them like chess pieces. You could fight bravely, win battles, serve loyally, and still lose everything if your lord fell out of favor. Honor didn't pay debts, and if you backed the wrong side in a war, you'd be stripped of land, title, and freedom faster than you could say oops. For every knight who became a legend, 100 more died namelessly in ditches, and the songs never mentioned them. Still, there was something hauntingly human about it all. They knew it was brutal. They knew it wasn't noble. But they also knew that if they didn't do it, someone else would. So they kept going, polishing their armor, sharpening their swords, saying their prayers, pretending it all meant something bigger than survival. And maybe, in a way, it did. Because even if the wars were senseless, even if the code was fake, the courage, the sheer human determination to keep moving through fear and exhaustion, that was real. And maybe that's why we still tell their stories, even now. Because it's comforting to think that courage can exist in a cruel world, even when everything else has gone to hell. So when you picture a medieval knight standing tall on the battlefield, Remember, beneath all that steel, he's sweating, trembling, and praying that someone doesn't stab him in the knee. And somewhere deep down, he's probably thinking the same thing you or I would. I really wish I'd just stayed home. And when the battle finally ended, there wasn't silence. Not the peaceful kind, anyway. Just a dull, awful quiet. The kind that sits heavy in your chest. The shouting stopped, the clash of metal faded, and all that was left were groans, flies, and the sound of wind dragging through grass that wasn't really grass anymore. Just mud, soaked with everything that used to be people. The thing no one tells you about war is how long it takes to end. You think it's over when the fighting stops, but the cleanup drags on for days. The living still have jobs to do, collect weapons, tend to the wounded, bury the dead, and strip the armor off corpses because metal's expensive and nothing went to waste. Imagine peeling armor off a body in summer heat. The smell, the flies, the noise of steel buckles and soft things underneath. Some knights did it themselves. Others had squires for that kind of grim work. But either way, everyone got used to death fast. You had to. If you didn't, you'd lose your mind. So they joked, they sang, they got drunk. Anything to make the smell and silence seem less real. Then there were the wounded hundreds, sometimes thousands of them. The lucky ones were bandaged and prayed over. The unlucky ones were just prayed over. The makeshift medical tents were nightmares, smoke, rot, screaming. Surgeons with blood to their elbows, hacking off limbs, while priests muttered blessings nearby. If you were a knight with a minor wound, you'd thank every saint you could name. And after all that, when it was finally over, came the strange hollow part, going back to camp, sitting by the fire, and pretending to be normal again. Some drank until they forgot, others prayed until dawn. Most just stared into the flames, hands shaking, armor still sticky with things they didn't want to think about. But knights weren't supposed to feel any of that. They were supposed to be brave, stoic, unbothered by the horrors of war. So they swallowed it down and joked about it later, turned trauma into funny stories over ale. Remember when we burned that village? Ah, good times. Laughter was easier than guilt. And the guilt was there, always. Because deep down, most knights knew what they were really doing. They called it duty, loyalty, faith. But sometimes it was just murder with better marketing. Still, life went on. The church told them that killing in the name of God wasn't sin, and who was going to argue with that? So they confessed, said their prayers, gave a few coins to the poor, and felt clean again. Medieval forgiveness worked fast. Once the fighting was done, and peace, or something like it, returned, knights had to go home. You'd think that part would be easy, but after living in chaos, normal life felt strange. Home didn't feel like home. Picture a man who spent months sleeping in mud, suddenly sitting in a warm hall with food and quiet. The same armor that once made him powerful now just makes him tired. The same sword that felt like part of his body now feels like a weight. And when his wife asks how the war went, he probably just says, "It was fine," because how do you even start to explain that kind of thing? Some knights handled it by throwing themselves into prayer. They built chapels, donated to monasteries, went on pilgrimages, trying to buy peace of mind one prayer at a time. Others couldn't sit still. They drifted from one war to the next, addicted to the noise and purpose. There was always another conflict somewhere. France, the Holy Land, the borders of Scotland. The world was never short on reasons to fight. And then there were the ones who fell apart quietly. The ones who drank too much, gambled too much, or picked fights just to feel alive again. The Middle Ages didn't have words like trauma or depression, but people noticed. They called it melancholy or a troubled spirit. You could see it in a man's eyes, the faraway stare, the restless hands. Some knights ended their lives in monasteries, trying to trade blood for prayer beads. Others just vanished, lost to history, buried in unmarked graves that no one sang songs about. And while we're at it, let's talk about what home really meant for a knight. If you were lucky, it was a stone manor with servants and a fireplace that didn't smoke too much. If you weren't, it was a drafty hall with rats in the grain and a leaky roof. Your land might have been burned during the war. Your tenants might have fled. Your livestock might be gone. So even peace could be another kind of battle, trying to rebuild everything that got destroyed while you were off playing hero. And knights didn't exactly get paid on time, if at all. Kings were notorious for promising money and then forgetting. So after risking your life for months, you might come home broke, hungry, and still owing your armorer. You couldn't exactly complain to the HR department. Your only option was to hope your lord eventually remembered he owed you 3 silver marks. Some took to freelancing, which sounds modern but basically meant mercenary work. You'd sell your sword to whoever paid best, loyalty optional. Entire bands of knights turned into roaming companies of hired fighters, offering their services to the highest bidder. These men were called routiers or free companies, and they were the medieval version of a security firm. If that firm occasionally looted towns when business was slow, they were feared, hated, but also needed, because when kings couldn't afford standing armies, they relied on these wandering veterans to do the dirty work. And those knights, hardened by years of war, didn't mind. They'd seen worse. To them, peace was just an intermission between battles. But not everyone could keep living that way. Some knights grew old, their bodies gave out. Wounds that healed years ago started aching every time it rained. Armor that once fit perfectly now pinched. Squires became knights themselves, and the old ones started to fade into the background. There was no retirement pension, no medal ceremony, just age, pain, and the quiet knowledge that the world was moving on without you. A few lucky ones managed to settle down, marry well, manage land, pass their stories down to children who would never know how it really was. But most ended up living modestly, forgotten. The songs stopped naming them. The world that once called them heroes had found new ones to sing about, and the strangest part, most knights accepted it, because deep down they knew they'd been part of a cycle that would never end. Young men dreaming of glory, old men warning them it wasn't worth it, and no one ever listening. That's the quiet tragedy of it. The glory always belonged to someone else, the poets, the kings, the people who never set foot on a battlefield. The knights were just the background noise of history, the part that bled so the stories could shine. But at night, when the fires burned low and the hall fell quiet, an old knight might sit there, staring into the flames, remembering the clang of steel, the faces of the fallen, the feeling of the charge. Maybe he'd still tell stories, laugh about it with whoever was willing to listen. But sometimes, in that laughter, there'd be a pause, a soft, sad silence, like the ghost of something he couldn't quite name. He might raise his cup, mutter something like, "To the old days," and drink. Because what else could he do? The world had moved on. The battles were over. The songs were written. And for once in his life, there was nothing left to fight. Still, as he closed his eyes, the sound would come back, the thunder of hooves, the crack of lances, the shouts of men, the smell of iron and smoke. And maybe, just for a heartbeat, he'd be back there again. Not proud, not noble, just alive. And then it would fade. The armor would cool. The world would be quiet again. And before a man ever reached that quiet place by the fire, he'd lived through a lifetime of lessons, bruises, and chores designed to make him forget what comfort even felt like. Because no one was born a knight. You had to be built into one, hammered, polished, and occasionally broken, until you were made of discipline instead of dreams. If you were lucky enough to be born into a noble family, your parents decided your fate early. Maybe you were their second or third son, the one who wouldn't inherit the estate. Congratulations, you were now destined for the sword. The oldest boy got the land. You got the bruises. So, at around 7 years old, you were sent away from home, packed off to live in another noble's household, not because your parents didn't love you, but because that's how the system worked. You couldn't become a proper knight under your own roof. You had to serve, learn manners, and basically spend your childhood as someone else's very polite servant. That's where you became a page, which sounds nice, like something from a fairy tale, but really meant tiny servant in training. You ran errands, fetched wine, cleaned armor, fed horses, and tried not to spill soup on anyone important. If you did, you learned humility very quickly. Between chores, you were taught the refined stuff, reading a little, writing your name if you were lucky, and how to act noble, bow properly, speak respectfully, and not pick your nose in front of ladies. But mostly, you learned obedience. A page's life was one long rehearsal for being bossed around later as a squire. Still, there were small rewards. You got to watch knights up close, shining, confident, larger than life. You watched them train in the courtyard, practicing swordplay or riding, and you dreamed of the day you'd wear armor too. You didn't see the exhaustion or the fear yet, just the glamour. By your early teens, you might be promoted to squire, which was exciting in the same way that being promoted from dishwasher to assistant dishwasher is exciting. The title sounds better, but the work's still awful. As a squire, you were assigned to a knight and became his personal assistant. You cleaned his armor, helped him dress, fed and cared for his horse, carried his weapons, and followed him everywhere, including into battle. You were the medieval version of a live-in intern. Your training got serious, though. You practiced sword fighting, jousting, archery, and wrestling. You learned how to fall off a horse without dying, how to polish metal until it gleamed, and how to swing a weapon until your arms went numb. You got up before dawn, trained till dusk, and then did chores till your back screamed. It wasn't glamorous. It was muscle memory, sweat, and pain. Your knight, depending on his mood, was either your mentor or your tormentor. Some treated squires kindly, like adopted sons. Others treated them like punching bags. Getting yelled at, hit, or humiliated was normal. It built character, they said. And maybe it did, or maybe it just built resentment. But squires also got front row seats to the reality of knightly life. They watched battles from behind the lines, carried messages through chaos, and patched wounds after the fighting was done. They saw the fear, the blood, the stink, and for many, that was the first time the shine came off the dream. Still, the promise of knighthood kept them going. Because when the day finally came, if it came, it was supposed to be glorious. The dubbing ceremony, the vigil, the prayers. You'd stay awake all night before being knighted, kneeling in a chapel, your sword laid out before you, reflecting on honor and duty. You'd wash your body and soul, literally, with a bath as a symbol of purity. You'd wear white, red, and black. White for purity, red for blood and courage, black for death. Because nothing says congratulations like being reminded of your mortality. Then, at dawn, in front of your peers and lords, you'd kneel while your knight, or sometimes a king, tapped your shoulder with a sword, and said the words, "Arise, sir, your name here." You'd rise, trembling, equal parts proud and terrified, now officially one of them. You'd swear oaths, to defend the weak, serve your lord, uphold justice, and all those other things the songs went on about. And then someone would probably spill ale on you at the feast that followed. It was the best day of your life, and the start of a long, hard decline. Because the moment you became a knight, the pressure began. You weren't just training anymore. You were expected to perform. You had to buy armor, a horse, weapons, servants, all of which cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Some families went bankrupt trying to outfit their sons properly. A poor knight was almost a contradiction in terms, but there were plenty of them. They just hid it well. A knight's life was a strange mix of splendor and squalor. One day you might dine in a castle on roasted swan, and the next you're sleeping in a ditch, gnawing on stale bread. You had to be ready for both, because loyalty wasn't optional, and orders could come at any time. And the more wars you fought, the more your body paid for it. Even training could break you. One bad fall from a horse could cripple you for life. There were no safety helmets, no insurance, no retirement home for knights with bad knees. You just limped, prayed, and kept going. Still, knights clung to the idea that their suffering meant something, that it was noble, part of a sacred path. They believed, or tried to believe, that God watched over them, that each bruise was proof of faith, each scar a mark of honor. It's easy to romanticize suffering when it's the only thing you've ever known. And yet, for all the pain, there were moments of beauty. The camaraderie between squires, the laughter after a hard day's training, the pride of mastering something difficult, the thrill of your first tournament, even if you got knocked on your back immediately, the warmth of the fire at night, the feeling of being young and strong and certain that you'd make history. Those were the moments that made it bearable, the ones they remembered later, when everything else turned into exhaustion and regret. And that's maybe the cruelest trick of it all. The system was designed to make boys dream of becoming knights, to fill them with ideas of glory and righteousness, so that by the time they saw the truth, it was too late to turn back. They'd already sworn oaths, already bled for it, already built their whole identity around it. But if you'd asked one of those young squires back then, bruised, sweaty, sore, if he still wanted to be a knight, he probably would have said yes without thinking. Because despite everything, the dream still burned bright, the armor still shone, the songs still promised that if you were brave enough, loyal enough, strong enough, you could become part of something bigger. And maybe, in a world as brutal as theirs, that kind of dream was the only thing that made sense. So the pages served, the squires endured, and the knights rose, one after another, generation after generation. each one convinced that maybe, just maybe, it would be different for them, that they'd be the one to live the songs instead of dying in them. And maybe that's why, even now, we still find them fascinating. Because somewhere, in every human heart, there's still that tiny spark that wants to be brave and noble and remembered, even if it means wearing armor that smells like sweat and regret. And once the ceremony, the oaths, and the cheering were over, the real work began, the kind that didn't get written into songs. Because for most knights, life wasn't an endless parade of battles and feasts. Most of the time, it was just life, long stretches of waiting, watching, maintaining, and trying not to die of boredom before someone found a reason to summon you again. When people imagine knights, they picture gleaming armor and heroic charges. But honestly, most knights spent more time dealing with mud than glory. When there wasn't a war on, and thankfully, there often wasn't, you became something between a local manager and a glorified farm supervisor. If you were lucky enough to own land, that meant keeping it running, overseeing crops, making sure your tenants paid rent, settling disputes between peasants, and checking that no one was stealing your pigs. Glamorous stuff. You might have trained for years to swing a sword, but most days, your weapon of choice was a ledger. And if you didn't own land, if you were just a knight for hire or a minor noble with no estate, things were even worse. You'd have to live under someone else's roof, serving in their hall, eating their food, waiting for them to call you to battle or send you on errands. Basically, you were a medieval freelancer, except your client could legally kill you for bad performance. Daily routines varied depending on where you lived and how rich you were. But let's say you were a mid-level knight with a small manor and a few servants. You'd wake up at dawn, not because you wanted to, but because roosters, servants, and church bells didn't care about sleep schedules. The first thing you did was pray. Everyone prayed. You had to thank God for letting you survive another night and ask for help surviving the day. Then you'd get dressed, and not in full armor, obviously. That was for war or ceremonies. Most of the time, knights wore tunics, hose, and boots, just like everyone else. The armor stayed in storage, polished and oiled, waiting for the rare day you'd actually need it. You might strap on a sword or dagger, though being armed was like wearing a watch, part of the outfit. Breakfast wasn't exactly exciting. Maybe some bread, cheese, or pottage, a thick grain porridge with whatever leftovers you could find. If you were lucky, a bit of bacon or a poached egg. Medieval meals weren't about flavor. They were about surviving till the next one. Then came work. Not sword-swinging, dramatic music kind of work, more like management. You'd inspect fields, visit tenants, resolve arguments, check defenses, or train your men at arms. You might have a few soldiers living on your land, or a small garrison if you were guarding a castle. You were responsible for feeding them, training them, and keeping them from stabbing each other in taverns. And of course, there was always maintenance. Armor rusted, weapons dulled, horses needed care every single day. You didn't just hop on a warhorse and ride into glory. You mucked its stall, brushed its coat, checked its hooves, and fed it oats that probably cost more than your servants' meals. Knights loved their horses, because they had to. Without one, you weren't a knight. You were just a guy with expensive metal pants. Speaking of servants, most knights couldn't function without them. You'd have grooms for your horses, pages for small errands, maybe a cook if you were lucky, and a steward who actually kept track of the money you didn't have. You'd also have a wife, or, if unmarried, a mother or sister managing the household. Women in these homes did most of the actual work that kept everything from collapsing. You just took credit for it when guests visited. When afternoon came, you'd train, because you had to stay in shape, and battle didn't give advance notice. You'd practice sword fighting, jousting, or riding, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone, sometimes against wooden dummies that had seen better days. It was sweaty, exhausting, and sometimes humiliating, especially if you hadn't eaten much or had too much ale the night before. If there was a tournament nearby, though, that was your time to shine. Knights loved tournaments, even though they were incredibly dangerous. It was a chance to show off, win prizes, or at least pretend you were famous. The crowd cheered, ladies waved ribbons, bards sang your name. It was all very dramatic until someone's ribcage collapsed. But hey, at least you'd die looking cool. After training, there might be visits to neighboring nobles, dinners, hunts, or feasts. Those were the fun parts. You'd dress up, gossip, and show off your new dagger or your latest scar. You might drink too much, boast too loudly, and wake up regretting everything. Knights were supposed to be paragons of virtue, but most were just men with too much mead and too many stories. And oh, the gossip. Knights' social lives were full of intrigue, alliances, rivalries, flirtations. Marriages were political chess moves, not romantic comedies. You didn't marry for love. You married for land. But that didn't stop people from finding affection elsewhere. Affairs were common, though risky. Nothing said career-ending scandal like seducing the wrong noble's wife. Evenings were quiet, unless there was a feast or trouble brewing. You'd eat supper, bread, meat if you could afford it, maybe stew or fish, drink ale or watered wine, and pray again. The church loomed large in every knight's life. You were constantly reminded that all your fighting, wealth, and ambition were meaningless if you didn't stay right with God. That's why so many knights ended up going on crusades or pilgrimages later, half from guilt, half from boredom. After supper, maybe you'd tell stories by the fire. Tales of Arthur, Roland, Charlemagne, the heroes who made your own struggles feel a bit nobler. Everyone loved those stories. They were pure propaganda, of course, but they helped you forget that most of your life was mud, paperwork, and saddle sores. And then you'd go to bed in a drafty room, probably smelling faintly of horses, smoke, and iron. If you were rich, you had furs and feather mattresses. If not, straw and rough blankets. You might share the room with your squire or servants. Privacy wasn't really a thing. Sleep came easily after days like that. You'd lie there listening to the fire crackle, the wind howl outside, and maybe your armor clinking softly in the corner. You'd think about old battles, debts you couldn't pay, or the rumors of war on the horizon. And maybe you'd whisper one last prayer, not for glory, but for peace. Because despite the songs and stories, most knights didn't crave endless adventure. They craved rest. They'd had enough of mud and fear and aching bones. They dreamed of something quieter, a warm bed, a good meal, maybe a gentle old age where they didn't have to hold a sword again. But that was the cruel irony of being a knight. You were built for war, but spent most of your life waiting for one. Your skills, your armor, your whole identity, all designed for something that, deep down, you hoped would never come. And when peace lasted too long, many knights didn't know what to do with themselves. They'd start small feuds, join tournaments, or volunteer for distant campaigns just to feel alive again. Because when your whole life revolves around battle, peace can feel like a kind of death. That's what made being a knight so tragic. He had trained your whole life for greatness, but greatness usually meant pain. He had dreamed of honor, but honor demanded suffering. He wanted to live by the sword, and eventually, he did. And maybe that's why their stories still echo today. Not because they were perfect, but because they were human. Brave, flawed, tired, humans trying to make sense of a world that demanded too much of them. They weren't legends in their own time, just people doing their best to live up to impossible songs. And in the quiet after the fires went out, when the armor was put away and the halls went dark, they probably knew it too. That for all their titles and triumphs, in the end, they were just tired men in cold rooms, dreaming of simpler lives they'd never have. And of course, for all the waiting and routine, battle always came eventually. It might start with a messenger galloping into the courtyard, shouting orders from some distant lord, or maybe rumors of raiders, a border dispute, a call to arms from your king. Whatever the reason, the peace you'd half resented suddenly didn't look so bad anymore. Because once you actually got on that horse and rode out in armor that weighed as much as a small child, all that glory you dreamed about started to feel like a very heavy mistake. Knights liked to talk about the thrill of combat, but the truth was, battle was chaos. Deafening, filthy, terrifying chaos. There were no elegant duels under fluttering banners, no soft music in the background, no slow motion charges with perfect choreography. It was noise, confusion, and mud. You couldn't even see properly half the time because your visor was fogging up or full of dust. The armor that made you look heroic in a painting was, in real life, like fighting inside a small metal coffin. It protected you, sure, but it also made you hot, stiff, and half blind. You could barely hear your own men shouting. Sometimes you couldn't tell if you were hitting the enemy or your own side, and by the time you figured it out, someone else's horse was trampling you. Let's not forget the smell. Iron, sweat, and fear all baking together in the sun. Horses panicked, Men screamed, and the ground turned slick with mud and blood. You could taste metal in the air, and not in a poetic way. And when people fell, they didn't die cleanly. They screamed, they begged. Sometimes they drowned in their helmets if they fell face first in mud and couldn't lift themselves. Sometimes a squire or another knight had to mercy kill them, because leaving them there was crueler. But in the middle of all that horror, the songs said you were supposed to remember your vows to be honorable, merciful, noble, to protect the weak and spare the defeated. Except, when the world turned into smoke and panic, those rules got blurry. The truth is, knights could be absolutely brutal. The chivalric code was more of an ideal than a rulebook. In reality, war was about survival, not poetry. Prisoners were taken if they were worth ransom, nobles, rich men, or anyone whose family might pay. But if you were just some poor soldier, you were probably left to rot. And even knights weren't immune to fear. Behind every brave charge was the terror of being trapped under your horse, of not being able to breathe, of your armor becoming your tomb. Once you were on the ground, getting up was almost impossible without help. And on a battlefield, help rarely came. Squires risked their lives to drag their knights out of danger, and many died doing it. Those stories about loyalty and courage, they were true, but they came from moments like that. Terrifying, desperate moments when one person refused to abandon another. The worst part wasn't even the fighting. It was the waiting before it started. Hours of tense silence, lines of men standing shoulder to shoulder, horses stamping nervously, the air thick with sweat and prayers. Some knights vomited from nerves before charging. Others muttered psalms under their breath, trying to convince themselves that God was watching, that he'd pick their side today. And when the charge finally came, it wasn't graceful. You'd slam your heels into your horse, lower your lance, and try to aim while bouncing in the saddle at full speed. Your vision narrowed to a tunnel, the enemy's armor glittering in front of you, the sound of hooves like thunder. The impact was bone-shattering. Even a perfect hit could send you flying. If you missed, or your lance broke wrong, you could dislocate your shoulder, or worse. Hand-to-hand combat was no better. Swords weren't the elegant dueling tools movies make them out to be. They were heavy, blunt, and used to smash more than slice. You'd aim for weak spots, joints, necks, armpits, anywhere the armor gapped. You didn't fight cleanly. You fought to win. And even if you did survive the day, the aftermath was gruesome. The field would be littered with bodies, men, horses, shattered weapons. The stench was indescribable. Squires and peasants went out afterward to strip the dead of valuables and armor. Nothing was wasted. Even blood-stained mail could be patched and reused. If you were wounded, you prayed it wasn't bad, because medieval medicine was, well, creative. A deep cut might get stuffed with moss or honey. A broken limb might be set with splints made of sticks and prayers. Infections were rampant, and there were no anesthetics, unless you counted wine or screaming. Some knights lived long enough to become legends, but many didn't. A single campaign could wipe out half a noble family. Those who came home often carried scars you couldn't see. They had nightmares, tremors, a constant sense that death was waiting just off stage. We'd call it PTSD now. Back then, they called it melancholy, or a troubled spirit. And yet, despite all of that, people still volunteered. They still charged into the fray, again and again. Why? Partly duty, partly pride, but mostly because there was no other way to prove yourself. Knights were trained from childhood to believe that honor lived in the heart of battle, that dying well was better than living quietly. Chivalry, that famous code, was supposed to make sense of all this. It said knights should be brave, loyal, courteous, and faithful to God. It was meant to turn killers into heroes. But the truth, it was mostly a PR campaign, a way for nobles to justify their wars. Sure, there were real acts of honor, knights rescuing comrades, sparing enemies, protecting villagers, but there were also massacres, betrayals, and greed dressed up as righteousness. Every code, no matter how noble, had loopholes wide enough to ride a warhorse through. Even tournaments, those supposedly safe battles, were deadly. The rules were supposed to prevent killing, but accidents happened constantly. Lances splintered, helmets cracked, necks snapped. It was entertainment for the audience and agony for the participants. And still, they lined up to do it again next season. There's something strangely human about that, the willingness to risk everything for a story. Because knights lived inside stories. Every charge, every wound, every death became part of a legend told by someone else later. You could be terrified, bleeding, half blind, and still think, maybe they'll sing about this someday. And maybe that's how they endured it. The hope that their pain would mean something, that even if they didn't survive, someone would remember their name, that their courage, or maybe just their stubbornness, would echo through time. But if you stripped away the songs and banners, what you had left was just people, sweaty, scared, exhausted, people trying not to die in the mud, people who missed home, who prayed for mercy, who wondered what all the fighting was really for. And when the battle finally ended, when the trumpets called the retreat and the screams faded, there was a strange silence. You'd take off your helmet, gulp down air, and realize how heavy the world felt again. You'd look around at the field, the wreckage of glory, and understand, deep down, that nothing about it had been noble. But you couldn't say that out loud. Not if you wanted to keep your place, your title, your pride. So you cleaned your sword, mounted your horse, and rode back home in silence. Maybe you said a prayer for the fallen, maybe you didn't, and when you reached your manor, your wife or servants would greet you, and someone would ask, was it a victory? You'd nod, of course, smile faintly, say something like, yes, God was with us. But later that night, when the fire burned low and everyone else had gone to bed, you'd sit there alone, staring into the embers, and think about the faces you'd seen that day. You'd wonder whether victory had ever really been the right word, and maybe you'd whisper another prayer. Not for glory this time, but forgiveness, because being a knight wasn't about being fearless. It was about carrying fear every day, and learning how to keep riding anyway. And after the battle came the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air itself had forgotten how to move. The noise, the shouting, the horses, the clash of metal, all of it stopped at once, leaving a ringing emptiness in your ears. That's when the weight of everything hit you. The exhaustion, the bruises, the little voice asking, what now? You'd take off your helmet, gasping for air, and your squire would rush up, wide-eyed, half shaking. He'd ask if you were all right, and you'd nod, even if you weren't. You always had to nod. You were a knight. You couldn't admit how badly your body hurt, how your hands were trembling, or how your heart still raced like it hadn't gotten the message that the fight was over. Then came the counting, the long, grim roll call of who was missing, who was dead, who was wounded beyond saving. You'd scan the field for familiar faces, and sometimes you'd see one that wasn't moving anymore. Someone who'd joked with you just that morning, who'd promised to share a drink when it was all done. There wasn't much time for grief. Bodies had to be cleared, wounded, tended, supplies gathered. You were expected to get back on your feet and keep functioning, even if every step felt like walking through fog. If you were injured, you prayed it wasn't serious. A broken bone meant weeks of agony and maybe never fighting again. A deep cut might mean fever and infection. If your squire or the camp surgeon could stop the bleeding, they'd stitch you up with rough thread, pour wine over it, maybe say a prayer. There were no guarantees. You could go to bed alive and wake up dead from infection 2 days later. And if you did survive, the scars were your souvenirs. Some knights wore them like trophies, others hid them under layers of fabric in silence. You couldn't show weakness, even when your body was falling apart. Pain was just part of the uniform. Once the field was cleaned and the wounded gathered, you'd ride back home, slower now, quieter. The cheers that greeted you at departure were gone. What waited for you now was a house that felt slightly unfamiliar, as if you'd left a piece of yourself behind. Your family would celebrate, of course. The servants would light candles. The cook would make something special. Your wife or mother would look at you like she couldn't decide whether to cry or scold you. You'd sit at the table, smiling, nodding, pretending everything was fine. But nights were the hardest. The dreams came first. Flashes of noise, mud, screams. You'd wake up drenched in sweat, not sure where you were. Sometimes you'd reach for a weapon that wasn't there. Sometimes you'd just lie still, staring at the ceiling, listening to your own heartbeat until morning. They didn't have words like trauma or PTSD. They just said you'd seen too much, or that your spirit was weary. Some nights turned to prayer, spending hours in chapels trying to wash their minds clean. Others turned to drink. Ale dulled the edges, at least for a while, but the silence always came back. And then there were the wounds that never healed properly. A twisted ankle that never stopped hurting. A shoulder that cracked every time you moved it. A limp that slowed you down but never quite stopped you. The average knight in his 40s probably moved like a man twice his age. Battle aged you faster than the years ever could. If you were unlucky enough to lose a limb, your life changed completely. Prosthetics existed, crude wooden pegs or hooks, but they were uncomfortable and made you more of a curiosity than a hero. Some disfigured knights became hermits or monks, retreating from the world that no longer had use for them. Others tried to keep living normally, even if it meant being the story everyone whispered about. The church encouraged knights to see suffering as holy. Pain was supposed to purify, to remind you of Christ's passion. But even faith had its limits when every breath felt like it came with a ghost. Some men who'd once been proud and loud fell silent after their campaigns. They stopped laughing at feasts. They prayed longer, spoke softer, and drank harder. And yet, life went on. You still had to manage your estate, oversee crops, attend your lord when summoned. No one cared if you were haunted. Duty didn't stop for nightmares. You just learned to function with them. Sometimes, you'd meet other knights who'd fought in the same war. You'd share a drink, maybe trade stories, half joking, half remembering. You could always tell who had seen the worst of it by how they looked away when the laughter started. Then there were the relics, trophies from battle, a captured banner, a broken lance, maybe even a piece of your own shattered armor. You kept them as reminders of your glory, though really they were anchors to memories you wished would fade. For some knights, the answer was pilgrimage. You'd hear of them setting off to holy places, Jerusalem, Santiago, Canterbury, hoping the journey would scrub their souls clean. They'd come back, thinner, quieter, sometimes a little more at peace, sometimes not. And then there were the tournaments again, the pageantry, the noise, the cheering crowds. For many, it was the only place they still felt alive. A safer kind of battle, or at least safer looking. The adrenaline was the same, the pain familiar, but the risk felt worth it. Some knights died in tournaments too, but they died in sunlight, not mud. The truth was, most knights didn't know how to live without conflict. Peace felt alien, too quiet, too empty. You could train, pray, drink, and sleep, but something inside you always stayed ready for the next call to arms. It was all you'd ever known. And if that call didn't come, you started to rot from the inside. Old habits turned into restlessness, then recklessness. Some picked fights over nothing, just to feel something again. Others went to war for causes they barely believed in, because the alternative was facing their own thoughts. That's what made knighthood such a trap. It gave you purpose, identity, a place in the world, but it took away everything else. You couldn't just retire. You couldn't hang up your sword and become a farmer. Even when your body failed, your name still carried the weight of battle. You were Sir forever, and in that title was the echo of every life you'd taken, every friend you'd buried, every prayer you'd whispered under your breath. Sometimes, late at night, you'd wander outside, feel the cold air on your face, listen to the quiet countryside that didn't remember war. The stars looked the same as they did when you were young, back when you dreamed of shining armor and glory. And maybe you'd smile, just a little, at the cruel joke of it all. Because back then, no one ever told you that the hardest part of being a knight wasn't dying in battle. It was surviving it, and so you survived. Which, oddly enough, didn't feel much like winning. Because after the battles were over, after the wounds healed, and the songs stopped being sung, there came another kind of trial. One with no enemy to charge at, no sword to raise, no purpose to cling to. You were older now. The hair under your helmet had thinned, your shoulders didn't sit quite as straight, and even simple tasks, climbing stairs, mounting a horse, came with the kind of size that used to belong to old men. Except now, somehow, you were one. You'd see the next generation of knights, fresh-faced, loud, their armor polished to a mirror shine, and feel that odd mixture of pride and envy. They were you, once, full of stories not yet written, eager to prove themselves, desperate for glory. You'd warn them to be careful, to train hard, to keep their swords sharp and their prayers sharper. They'd nod, of course, but you knew they wouldn't really listen. No one ever did at that age. Sometimes they'd come to you for advice, all respectful and eager. Sir, they'd ask, what was it like at Crecy, or Hastings, or Agincourt? And you'd tell them, gently leaving out the parts about the smell, the screaming, the mud that never left your boots. You'd give them the version that sounded noble, the one people liked to hear. But in your head, you'd remember the real thing, and thank God they didn't have to know it yet. Retirement wasn't really a word in your world. There was no pension plan for knights. You might get a bit of land, maybe a few peasants to work it, if you'd been loyal and useful to your lord. But running an estate was its own battlefield. Taxes, crops, quarrels between villagers, all of it needed your attention. You'd gone from swinging a sword to arguing about barley yields, and the armor, that shining second skin, hung in the corner now, collecting dust. You'd polish it sometimes, out of habit more than hope. The leather straps were cracked, the chain links a little rusted. It was strange to look at it and realize it had once felt like part of you. Now it looked more like a relic. Your body, too, had become a museum of old injuries. Every joint had its own complaint. Every morning began with the creak and pop of history catching up to you. You could feel old sword cuts when the weather turned cold. The limp from that one campaign never quite went away. Your doctor, if you had one, might suggest herbs, baths, maybe a bit less ale. You'd nod, promise to behave, then ignore half of it. What else was there to do? You'd earned your comforts. And yet, for all that, something in you still itched for the old days. When a distant bell rang or a horse galloped past your window, a flicker of instinct would make your heart jump. For a split second, you'd almost reach for your sword again before remembering it was all over. Sometimes, when young squires trained in the courtyard, you'd stand at the edge and watch. Their laughter, their clumsy bravado, it was like seeing ghosts of your own past selves. You'd want to tell them everything you'd learned, the lessons pain had carved into your bones. But most of them wouldn't understand until it was too late. So you just watched, silent, the way old soldiers always do. The world itself had changed too. The castles that once seemed invincible were now being tested by new things: cannons, gunpowder, strange weapons that made armor almost useless. The age of the sword was slipping away, and with it, your place in the world. Some knights adapted. They traded lances for leadership, becoming generals or tacticians. Others turned to politics, managing estates, advising kings. But many couldn't adjust. When your whole identity was built around combat and chivalry, what did you do when those things no longer mattered? The church started calling for fewer crusades. Lords began hiring common soldiers instead of noble-born knights. Wars were changing faster, louder, more brutal. You couldn't stop it. You'd hear whispers in the hall. "He's one of the old kind," they'd say about you, half in awe, half in pity. And maybe they were right. You were from another time, when honor meant something, even if it killed you. On cold nights, you'd sit by the fire, hands wrapped around a cup of wine, staring at the flicker of flames. They reminded you of torches from old sieges, bright, unpredictable, beautiful, and gone too soon. You'd think of friends long buried, of banners lost to history, of promises made to gods and kings who no longer remembered your name. Some knights turned to God more deeply in old age. They'd join monasteries, trade steel for silence. A few found peace there, tending gardens, copying books, praying for the souls of those they'd killed. Others simply went mad from the quiet. After years of noise, the hush of monastery walls could feel unbearable. If you were lucky, your family kept you close. Your children, if you had them, grew into their own lives. Maybe your son took your sword and name, marching into the same cycle you'd just escaped. Maybe your daughter married into another house, strengthening alliances you barely understood. And if you had no heirs, the end felt lonelier still. You might look at your coat of arms, the painted shield that once announced your name to the world, and realize it would die with you. All those years of fighting, bleeding, serving, and soon it would all be memory. You'd find small joys to fill the days, teaching a squire to ride, feeding the horses, listening to the soft hum of the countryside you once protected with your life. You'd start to notice how beautiful the ordinary could be, the way light touched stone at dawn, the smell of rain on old wood, the sound of distant church bells. There was something gentle about this stage of life. You'd stopped pretending to be invincible. You could finally admit that you were tired. You could even laugh about the foolishness of your youth, the dreams of glory, the vanity, the endless hunger for recognition. All of it seemed so far away now. But the world still had one last lesson. Age didn't mean safety. Bandits still roamed. Plagues came and went. Kings made wars that no one wanted. You could spend your whole life surviving battle after battle, only to fall to a fever or a bad wound, reopened by a stumble. Death had a sense of irony like that. And when the end finally came quietly, perhaps in bed instead of on the field, your last thought might not be about victory or honor at all. It might be something simpler. a field in spring, the warmth of a fire, the laughter of your comrades before everything changed. Because in the end, for all its noise and blood, knighthood was still just life, magnified, dramatized, wrapped in metal. You'd been brave and foolish, cruel and kind, proud and terrified. You'd been human, and that, more than any sword or title, was the truth of it. And somewhere, while the old knight sat by the fire listening to his joints crack louder than his armor ever did, the world began rewriting his story. The poets came first. They loved a good knight. Oh, they adored them, shining heroes riding into sunsets, rescuing maidens, defending the weak, slaying dragons. The poets didn't care that most knights spent their days collecting rent, smelling of horse sweat, or yelling at peasants about missing hay. No, in their verses, the knight became something else entirely, flawless, pure, noble, the perfect man of God and war, brave without cruelty, strong without pride. You could almost imagine some old, scarred knight hearing one of those songs and laughing himself hoarse, because if he'd ever met a knight like that, he'd probably have tried to hit him with a mug, just to see if the story was true. But the myth had power. It was comforting. In a world full of famine, war, and bad weather, people liked to believe that somewhere out there rode a perfect man who could set things right. The songs made sense of chaos. They turned brutality into beauty. Soon, every court wanted its own tales. The troubadours sang of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, Gawain and the Green Knight. They painted chivalry in gold and silk, love that was noble, loyalty that was pure, battles that were glorious. The blood got edited out, the mud forgotten, the screaming replaced with harps, and people listened. Lords began to expect their knights to act like the men in the poems. The church joined in, to pushing the idea that knighthood wasn't just a job, it was a holy calling. Knights were told to fight for faith, protect widows, defend orphans. It all sounded very grand, except that most knights couldn't afford to live up to it. You can almost picture a young knight, barely 20, being told to be pure of heart, while also being ordered to burn down a village that hadn't paid taxes. Try balancing those commandments. The code of chivalry was less of a rulebook and more of a fantasy. It wasn't written down in one neat list. It shifted depending on who was talking. The church said chivalry meant fighting for God. The lords said it meant loyalty to them. The poets said it meant love and honor. And the knights themselves, they mostly said, "Can I eat now?" But the stories stuck. By the 12th and 13th centuries, chivalry had become fashion. You weren't just a soldier, you were an idea. You were expected to act knightly, whatever that meant. You had to speak politely, write poems, dedicate your victories to ladies you barely knew. Imagine trying to do all that after spending the morning knee-deep in a pigsty inspecting your manor's grain stores. Yet that's what it became, theatre. Knights played the role society wanted to see, and maybe, sometimes, they even believed it themselves. The tournaments fed this myth. Once they were rough free-for-alls where men got concussions for fun. But as the years passed, they became pageants, colorful, organized, almost courtly. Banners waved, trumpets sang, ladies tossed scarves, and poets scribbled frantically in the corner, already turning bruises into poetry. And the funny thing is, the myth started to reshape reality. A knight who wanted prestige had to look chivalrous. The armor got fancier, the jousts got cleaner, the speeches longer. Public image mattered as much as skill. A single gallant gesture could win more favor than a dozen victories. The real irony, though, was that while everyone was romanticizing knighthood, the world that created knights was slowly dying. Gunpowder arrived quiet, black, and world-changing. It didn't care about chivalry. You could spend your whole life training to fight with a sword, and one lucky shot from a clumsy farm boy with a musket could end you in an instant. Armor, once a badge of honor, became a liability. Too heavy, too expensive, and increasingly useless against bullets. The proud knight was turning into a relic faster than he realized. But poets don't write about obsolescence. They write about glory. So the myth kept growing even as the reality shrank. The tales of Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, already centuries old, got retold again and again, until they became the ideal everyone measured against. By the late Middle Ages, even the knights themselves were leaning into it. They started holding orders of chivalry, complete with oaths, emblems, and fancy ceremonies. It was like a mix between a military club and a costume party. You'd wear a badge, swear loyalty, talk about virtue, and then, the next week, go to war and loot a church. Chivalry was a game of appearances now. To be seen as noble was almost as good as being noble. People quoted ideals they had no intention of living by. You might kneel before your lady in public, then argue over land rights in private. You might praise mercy in a poem, then burn a village at dawn. And yet, people believed, because belief was easier than truth. The truth was ugly. Knights were human, just as capable of cruelty, fear, and failure as anyone else. But the myth made sense. It gave people something to admire. As centuries passed, kings realized this too. They started using chivalry as propaganda. Wars were framed as holy crusades or noble causes. Knights were told they were fighting for love, honor, and justice, never for power or money, even when that was exactly what it was about. And then came the Renaissance, with its thinkers, painters, and dreamers, and the old world of knights turned into art, paintings of shining warriors, poems about eternal devotion, plays where love conquered all. By then, real knights were gone, replaced by soldiers in uniforms and generals with maps. But the legend lived on, glowing brighter now that no one could check it against reality. The poets had won. They'd taken a messy, violent, exhausting life and turned it into bedtime stories. Which is, in a way, exactly what you're listening to now. Because that's what humans do. We take pain and turn it into poetry. We take mud and make it gold. The knights weren't saints, they were just people trying to survive their time. But the stories gave them something larger than life, something that would last. So the next time you see a shining knight in a movie, remember that somewhere underneath all that polish was a man who once cursed his armor for pinching his shoulders, smelled like horse sweat, and went to bed wondering if his knees would ever stop hurting. And yet, maybe that's what makes the myth beautiful. It's not that knights were perfect, it's that we wanted them to be. And eventually, the real knights disappeared altogether. Not in a single dramatic moment, no last stand, no grand farewell, but slowly, quietly, the way old things fade when no one's paying attention anymore. The castles began to crumble first. Their stones were taken for barns and churches, their moats dried up, their banners forgotten. The sound of armor being hammered in the blacksmith's shop grew rarer. Metalworkers started making pistols instead. The age of the sword gave way to the age of smoke. You could almost imagine some very old knight, grey-bearded and weary, standing at the edge of a battlefield full of gunpowder and noise, looking at it all with quiet disbelief. He'd spent his whole life perfecting the art of close combat, the rhythm of hoofbeats, the clash of steel, the dance of courage and timing, and now men just stood in rows and fired at each other from a distance. No honor, no chivalry, just smoke, noise, and blood. For a man raised on oaths and ceremony, it must have felt like watching the world lose its soul. But history moves whether anyone's ready or not. The knight became a fossil in his own lifetime. Kings still used the title, of course, Sir this, Sir that, but by the 16th century, it meant politics more than battle. Being a knight was something you earned with loyalty, not bravery. You could be knighted for poetry, for service at court, even for inventing something clever. It was a polite version of what had once been brutal, and maybe that was for the best. But for the ghosts of the real thing, the ones buried under ruined keeps and unmarked fields, it must have seemed like the world had rewritten them. The few who lived long enough to see it must have felt the change deep in their bones. The young no longer looked to them for advice on warfare, only for stories. And they obliged, sitting by firesides, telling tales of dragons and duels that grew softer and stranger with every retelling, because what else could they do? When you outlive your purpose, all that's left is memory. Soon, those stories started to sound more like fairy tales. The blood was cleaned up, the loss edited out. Knights became the stars of bedtime stories told to children, symbols of courage and goodness, not men of violence and debt. It was oddly fitting, really. Knights had once been the nightmares of peasants, armored tax collectors, who could crush rebellions or seize land. Now they were the stuff of dreams. The world moved on. Musketeers replaced cavalry. Cannons replaced lances, and the battlefield became something you planned on paper instead of wading into on horseback. But even as the weapons changed, the idea of the knight refused to die. It lived on in paintings, in books, in hearts that longed for something noble. Writers like Cervantes noticed that too, and laughed at it. When Don Quixote tilted at windmills, he wasn't mocking knights themselves, but the world's obsession with their myth. Quixote was a man born too late, dreaming of a chivalry that never really existed, trying to be noble in a world that had outgrown the idea. And that's the sad, funny truth about myths. Even when the world moves on, we still reach for them. We want to believe that there was once a time when courage had meaning, when honor was clear, when good and evil wore different colors. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the myth came roaring back. Painters filled canvases with knights in gleaming armor, kneeling before golden-haired maidens. Poets revived Arthur's court, Camelot, the Round Table. Chivalry became nostalgia, a dream of a purer, simpler past that never was. The Victorians, in particular, loved their knights. To them, knighthood symbolized decency, restraint, moral order. Never mind that the real knights had been professional killers. In the 1800s, a knight was a gentleman, a romantic ideal. Tennyson's poetry turned old, muddy stories into sacred epics. Museums collected rusting armor and polished it until it gleamed brighter than it ever had in battle. And somewhere, under all that shine, the truth slept. The aching backs, the festering wounds, the endless obedience to men richer and crueler. But maybe that's what myths are for. They're not lies. They're memories smoothed down so they don't hurt anymore. So even as knights vanished from the fields, they marched on in imagination. Painters drew them kneeling before queens. Writers dreamed up codes of chivalry, purer than any that had ever existed. And in that process, the knights found immortality of a different kind. Because the world still needs them, not as warriors, but as symbols. The idea of a person who stands between chaos and safety, who fights for something beyond themselves, even when the fight is hopeless. It's ironic, isn't it? The same figures who once inspired terror now lull us to sleep. Their steel, their blood, their sweat, all softened by time, turned into lullabies of bravery. You can almost imagine them, those long-dead knights, listening in from wherever they ended up, maybe shaking their heads, maybe chuckling, or maybe, just maybe, proud that they've become something gentler in death than they ever managed to be in life. And as you drift, you might realize that knighthood never really died. It just changed its shape. Every time someone stands up for something, protects someone weaker, keeps a promise even when it hurts, that's a little piece of the same code, reborn. It's smaller now, quieter, stripped of banners and horses, but it's still there. And maybe that's the best kind of ending. The myth that survived, not because it was perfect, but because people needed it to be. And by the time the last real knight had turned to dust, the world had learned how to sleep through its own stories. The clang of armor became a whisper, and all those battle cries softened into the kind of songs you hum without realizing where they came from. People still spoke of knights, of course, just differently now. They appeared in stained glass and storybooks, in tapestries that hung in quiet halls where no one remembered the faces that inspired them. Children pointed at them and said, "Look, a hero." Adults smiled and didn't correct them. And maybe that's how myths should end, not with a bang, but with a bedtime story. Because that's what history does. Eventually, it takes the noise, the chaos, the heartbreak, and it sands them down until they fit neatly into a tale we can tell ourselves at night. The knight who once reeked of sweat and fear becomes a vision of courage and virtue. The wars he fought fade into quests, the screams turn into songs. And you know what? Maybe that's okay. Maybe we need the softer versions sometimes. The real world can be loud enough already. In some quiet medieval village, a few centuries after the wars were done, someone might still have found an old, dented helmet buried in the dirt. They'd pull it out, hold it up to the light, and wonder whose head it had protected. A local legend might form a brave sir, something who defended the town against invaders. And just like that, another story was born. Nobody would know that maybe the man who wore it wasn't a hero at all. Maybe he was just tired, scared, following orders. Maybe he'd hated the war. Maybe he'd wanted to go home. But the story would outlive him, and it would be kind. Generations later, people started collecting those old armors again. Kings and collectors filled halls with them, polished, arranged, admired. Tour guides would point and say, "This belonged to a great knight." And maybe it did. Or maybe it was just the only one whose armor survived. History, after all, remembers things better than people. When you stand in front of one of those suits today, shining, silent, hollow, it's easy to forget there was ever a body inside. A person who once complained about the heat, who laughed with friends, who muttered prayers before battle, who dreamed of something beyond war. The armor is all that's left, and yet somehow it tells the story better than any book ever could. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear it creak, like it's stretching after a long nap. Maybe it's remembering. Maybe it's waiting for the next dreamer to walk by and imagine themselves inside it. And that's the funny, comforting thing about legends. They're half memory, half wish. We reshape them over and over until they fit the way we need them to. The knight who once lived for survival becomes the knight who lived for honor. The man who fought because he had to becomes the man who fought because he believed. We do it not to lie, but to heal, to make peace with what was. Every age builds its own knights, not in armor, but in spirit. Some wear suits and ties instead of chainmail. Some wield microphones, stethoscopes, or pens instead of swords. The tools change, but the longing doesn't. We still crave that sense of courage, that feeling that someone, somewhere, is standing guard while the rest of us sleep. So maybe the myth of knighthood isn't false at all. Maybe it's just incomplete. The real knights were messy and human and afraid. The ones in stories are what we hope to be, and the space between the two, that's where history lives. There's something gentle about realizing that. The noise quiets, the sharp edges soften, the armor turns to silver in the candlelight. You start to see that the story of the knight was never really about war. It was about endurance, about how people keep trying, century after century, to be a little braver than they were yesterday. And as the world turns, that old echo stays, not as a shout, but as a heartbeat, slow, steady, familiar, like the sound of hooves fading down a moonlit road. You can almost see it now, a single rider, far in the distance, heading home. No banners, no trumpets, no crowds, just the soft clink of metal, the quiet rhythm of breath, the steady thud of a horse that knows the way. The night is cool, the air smells of earth and wood smoke, and for once finally there's peace. The night doesn't need to be remembered anymore. The world remembers enough. The myth can sleep now, tucked into songs and stories, into books and dreams. And you, listening here, are part of that same quiet inheritance. Because every time we tell these tales again, every time we remember the people behind the armor, we give them one more moment of life. So let the story rest now. Let the armor cool. Let the world drift back to silence. Somewhere, beyond all the noise and memory, the last knight lays down his sword, exhales softly, and disappears into the same kind of peace he never found in life. And maybe that's the real happy ending. Not victory, not glory, just rest. And now, as the last echoes of that long, clattering age fade into the dark, all that's left is the quiet. The kind of quiet that fills an empty hall after the candles burn down, soft, warm, still carrying the ghost of laughter and footsteps that have long since gone. The knights are gone now. The castles are ruins. The swords are rust. The armor sits behind glass where no one will ever swing it again. But their story, somehow, it lingers. Not in battles or blood, but in whispers, in bedtime tales, in the strange comfort of thinking that once upon a time, someone brave stood guard against the dark. That's the funny thing about history. It never really ends. It just lies down for a while and dreams. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the faint sounds of that dream. The creak of saddle leather, the low murmur of a horse shifting in its sleep, the flicker of firelight against stone walls, a breath, a heartbeat, a pause that stretches out until it feels like forever. And maybe that's the truest version of knighthood. Not the battles, not the glory, not the songs, just the endurance, the persistence, the will to keep going, even when the world has forgotten your name. Somewhere deep inside that myth, beneath the shining armor and the grand speeches, there was always just a person trying to do what they thought was right. Scared sometimes, foolish often, but still moving forward, still believing that honor meant something, even if no one else did. Maybe that's why the story still works. Because even now, hundreds of years later, we still want to believe that decency survives, that courage doesn't vanish, that there's a little bit of the knight left in all of us, even if we don't wear the armor, even if our battles look nothing like theirs. It's comforting, isn't it? To think that history isn't just about what people did, but about what they tried to be. So if tonight you find yourself drifting off to sleep with visions of shining armor, let them be gentle ones. Let the knights in your dreams laugh instead of fight. Let them ride through meadows instead of battlefields. Let them take off their helmets, feel the cool night air, and rest their tired faces under a sky full of stars, because that's what they never got enough of: rest. The wars are over now, the horses have gone still, the banners have long since fallen to dust, but the story, this story, is still here, breathing softly in the quiet, and maybe that's all a story really wants in the end. Not applause, not glory, just to be remembered kindly, to be told once more, softly, by someone who's still awake enough to care. So sleep now, traveler. The world outside is quieter than it's been in centuries. The nights have gone home, the fires are low, and somewhere, beyond all this history, something ancient and gentle keeps watch, not with swords, but with silence. You can rest, too, because for tonight, at least, you've kept them alive. Soft pause, the voice fades, like the embers of a long story burning low. Thanks for listening, and for keeping another corner of the past awake, even just for a little while. This was Oop-S All History, and that was why it sucked to be a medieval knight. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.